Well, hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of Reclaiming Irresistible, a series of content that we've been going through together as we discover what it looks like for our church, for Current, to be irresistible to the community that's around us, in much the same way that Jesus was irresistible to people that were around him when he was here on this earth. Now, if you were with us last week, you may recall that we've been talking about, we're trying to capture the simplicity of that original mission, the original vision of the early church, the church that Jesus started, and the mission that he gave them as he handed the church off to imperfect people for them to further his kingdom, to further his mission. So he created the mission for us as a church, and our way of saying it at Current is that our mission is to encourage, equip, and lead people to follow Jesus, to be his disciples, wherever they currently are in their faith. So for you, for anybody that comes in contact with Current, we want to help them follow Jesus, to take a step in the direction of Jesus a little bit more. Now, last week we talked about our vision, and our vision is driven by, it's closely related to our mission. Our vision at Current is to create a church where unchurched people love to engage with us, where they engage with us through some irresistible environments that we've created for them, for adults, for kids, for students, that they really want to be a part of. We also want them to engage with us through transformational connections. We want you and for others to be able to make transformational connections, to have relationships that change our lives. You can find those relationships through small groups and through online connections, that kind of thing. And then we also want to create opportunities to make a lasting impact, meaning for you and other people that serve at Current, we want you to make a lasting impact in our community and around the world, not only inside the walls of our church, but also outside the walls of our church. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create some environments that reflect the personality, reflect the purpose of Jesus. And Jesus gave us that purpose when he was here on this earth. He said that he came to seek and to save the lost. Now, because Jesus placed really great value on lost people, we also believe at Current that it's worth just focusing our entire church, our entire ministry, towards people who don't know Jesus, and towards people who maybe feel like they don't belong anywhere. So several years ago, I was looking for a new job in ministry, and I was applying to a lot of different places. And one of the jobs that kind of rose to the top as far as a contender that we were interested in was a job that was out of state. And I had had several interviews with them, and I was very interested in this church. And I requested to them at a certain point in the process, I was like, hey, would it be possible for my family, for us to come visit you on a Sunday? Because we would love to know what you're really all about, get the full experience. Also love for you to get the full experience of who we are as well. And so they were like, yeah, let's do that. And I said, I do have one request though. If we're going to do this, if we're going to make the trip, because it was an out of state trip and we were going to have to travel with our 2 kids and everything. I was like, if we're going to do this thing, is it possible for only the people that need to know that we're coming, for them to know? And they were like, sure, we'll set that up. And we'll make sure that for the most part, people don't know you're coming. And the reason that I wanted that is because I wanted to get to experience this church from the perspective, from the eyes of kind of a first-time guest. Like if somebody in that community were to walk in the doors of that church and experience it, I wanted to kind of see what that experience would be like through their lens. And so we show up on a Saturday night. We drove over there several hours. We show up on a Saturday night, and Sunday morning comes around. We get up, my wife and I, we get our 2 kids at the time ready to go to church that morning. Now, mind you, I'm pretty sure we hadn't been in the doors of the church quite yet to that point. We wanted, again, to experience the whole thing for the first time as a first-time guest. And so we weren't really sure where to park. We found a parking lot across the street from what appeared to be the main entrance of the church. Turns out everybody else parked in another parking lot. It was kind of a weird thing, but we parked there. We walk across the street. We walk up the sidewalk to what appears to be the main entrance. And there at the main entrance, the doors open for us by a couple of people that were there to open doors for people. And they opened the doors to us. We start to walk in, and it was really interesting. They gave us this look like, who are you? What are you doing here? I've never seen you here before. Like, what's going on here? And they didn't say a word. They didn't say anything to us. Not even, hey, not welcome, nothing. It stood out to us as fairly odd. We walk into the lobby. There were people there in the lobby. Again, same, like, who is this type of looks from people. Again, nothing was said. We walked by all of them. We walked by 2 ushers that were holding the sanctuary or the auditorium doors open for people as well. Again, not a word was said to us. And so we were like, we're not really sure what we're doing. We didn't really know what to do. But we walk into the sanctuary, and our family kind of slid into a row about 3 or 4 rows from the back. We just like slid in, sat down, and we prepared for this service that was about to happen. And I kid you not, this was very, it stood out to us. and it's stuck with us ever since. An usher approaches us, and he says to us, I'll never forget this. He says, "I'm really sorry, but you can't sit there." And this was the first thing that somebody from this church had said to us since we had walked in the doors. "I'm sorry, but you can't sit there." Now, there's probably a whole lot more of the story we can talk about another time, and the way the story ends, in a way, is that we ended up going there and working there in the end. I ended up taking the job because I believed that our family could do something to kind of influence that culture and improve that culture of welcoming people into the church. But for a moment, I want you to think what I was thinking in that moment when that happened. Imagine with me if I was an unchurched person or a de-churched person, somebody who hadn't walked in the doors of a church in years, or maybe had never walked in the doors at all. Can you imagine if somebody in that community was thinking to themselves, "Man, I've got a problem in my marriage, I've got a problem in my parenting, I've got a problem with my finances, I've got a problem with, you name it, whatever area of my life, and I feel like the church probably has the answer to this, so I'm going to go check it out." Can you imagine if that person were me, and they walked into this building, and the first thing that they were told was, "I'm sorry, but you can't sit there"? I would imagine they probably wouldn't come back. And that's the kind of place that we want to avoid. That's not really the kind of place that we want to be as current. We want to create a place for people who feel like they don't belong. Not at the expense of insiders. We still want people that are a part of this thing, that are insiders, that have been doing this thing for years. We want them to have a place where they can grow in their faith as well. But we want to create a place for people who feel like they don't belong, a place for all people to grow in their faith wherever they currently are in that journey. So this week, what I want to do is I want to actually look at and explore the first big controversy that happened in the church when the church had just begun. It was early on in the church's history, right after Jesus had left it in the hands of imperfect people. And this controversy that happened, it actually resurfaces. It's come up throughout the history of the church in various different ways, and I think it still exists even today in various ways as well. And really what it was at the core was an argument amongst church people. And the question was, what do people outside of the church, what do they have to do? What rules do they have to follow? What things must they do in order to be a part of this Jesus movement? In other words, they were asking, who is the church actually for? Now, this controversy was kind of stirred up by the Apostle Paul, because the Apostle Paul had spent several years at this point. He had been traveling the entire known world, inviting Gentiles. And if you're not really familiar with the term Gentile, all that means is anybody who's not a Jew. So if you're watching this and you don't consider yourself a Jew, you would be considered a Gentile. So Paul's traveling around inviting like all Gentiles, all Jews, everybody to be part of this Jesus movement, to follow Jesus. Now, as you might imagine, if you think about it, for Jewish leaders, for Jewish people, what Paul was doing was disruptive. It was kind of unsettling for them. You see, Paul was inviting people to be part of the church who had no knowledge of and no connection to the Jewish tradition. In fact, Paul was inviting people to be a part of this thing that, based on the way the Jews felt, the way that the Jews behaved, like they believed that these people behaved offensively. They were even considered to be gross to the Jewish people. And because Jesus was a Jew, and because Jesus fulfilled Jewish prophecy through his death and through his resurrection, there were people that believed you had to become a Jew in order to follow Jesus. And the Apostle Paul, he kind of threw a wrench in this entire thing. And some of the things that one of Jesus's disciples, his followers, Peter, did early on as well, like what Paul and Peter did, threw a wrench in this entire way of thinking. Because Paul, as he was traveling the world, he began to open doors to anybody and everybody who just wanted to take a step in the direction of Jesus. Now, I don't know your church history. I don't know where you're coming from if you're watching this. Perhaps at some point in your life, you've had a not so great experience with the church. And maybe that bad experience caused you to eventually leave the church for a season or for a time, or maybe even for decades. I don't know. But if you had an experience that was so bad that it caused you to not want to be a part of this thing for a while, it could actually be a little bit of a modern day take on this particular issue. Maybe you had somebody decide for you that you weren't good enough to be part of this thing, or maybe they kind of communicated to you intentionally or unintentionally that you don't really belong as part of this thing. As a result of that, perhaps you felt pushed away from God, or maybe they pushed you away from God. And if that's happened to you, or if that's happened to somebody that you know, I just want to apologize to you that that happened. And I think the reason that that happened is because us Jesus followers, we're just constantly trying to figure this thing out. We're just constantly like wrestling what it looks like to balance grace and to balance truth in our lives. We desperately, as Christians, like real Jesus followers, we want to reflect God's grace to people that are far away from God so that they experience his love. But us Jesus followers constantly struggle with this impulse to constantly confront people with God's truth. Because far too often we think that accepting the truth should come before we actually receive God's grace. I mean, that was the perspective of the son in the story of the prodigal son. We talked about it last week. There was another son as well who didn't leave his father, who didn't walk away from his relationship with his father. And so he was kind of a little jealous of the fact that this son was welcomed in with open arms, with grace-filled arms from his father. And so he felt like, listen, this just doesn't seem fair. And I think that's so often what happens with us as Christians. We feel like, okay, if grace comes to people first before they change their behavior, well, that doesn't seem all that fair to us. But when Jesus was here on this earth, he wasn't like a balance of truth and grace. He wasn't 50% truth and 50% grace. He was 100% of both. He was fully grace and fully truth. He didn't compromise grace for truth, and he didn't compromise truth in order to be graceful towards people. You see, Jesus loved sinners. He loved people that were far from God, but he also drew them to some uncomfortable truths. And so we just believe, if we're looking like Jesus, if we're acting like Jesus, that if grace and truth don't collide in our church, that we're probably doing something wrong. All right, so back to that first conflict that was experienced in the church. At this point, just picture this, the church is about 20 years old at this point in the church's journey. And Paul has just completed his first missionary journey around the world. He's just figured out, or he's just gone around the world. He's invited all kinds of people to be a part of this Jesus movement at this point, okay? And we're going to pick this up in Acts chapter 15, which comes to us from Luke. Luke, who was there to experience much of what he wrote about for himself in the book of Acts. Now, this is a little bit of a long passage, but we're going to dig into it for just a few minutes. This is what Luke tells us. He says that certain people came down from Judea to Antioch, and they were teaching the believers. This is what they were teaching them. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Now, we joke about this kind of often around here, but I would imagine at this point in the church's journey, there probably were a lot more women in the church than men, right? Because the men were going, okay, hold on. In order to be a part of this thing, you're telling me that I have to have surgery? I mean, these people were teaching everybody, listen, you can't be a Christian, you can't be a Jesus follower without first accepting the Jewish law. That's what this whole thing really meant. What they were really saying is, you can't be a Christian unless you accept the Jewish law. Now, because of that, that brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with those people that were teaching that thing. You see, Paul and Barnabas, they've been traveling the entire world telling people that salvation comes only from faith in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. It comes through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. Like, that was it. As far as Paul and Barnabas were concerned, Jesus' death and resurrection wiped out every single other requirement. That was it. The only thing that mattered was trust in Jesus. That was it. And so Paul and Barnabas, as a result of this, they were appointed along with some other believers to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and the elders about this question. And when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. They're like, listen, guys, we've been traveling around the entire world, and Jesus has been showing up. He's been changing lives, people that are Jews, people that are Gentiles. It's been amazing. Well, then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees, which, by the way, this is kind of interesting if you think about it, like, fun fact, there were Pharisees who eventually started following Jesus, who eventually became part of this Jesus movement. Like, that's kind of a neat thing. Pharisees who were responsible for Jesus' death, all right? They stood up and they said something, and it's important what they said, because here's the problem. Even though they were following Jesus now, they still continue to hold on to those traditions of their Jewish faith, the rules, the regulations, these different things that a lot of which they had just made up. They were holding on to those things. And so this is one of the things that they taught. They said, listen, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. At this point, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples speaks up, Peter. He speaks up, he says, listen, guys, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. He's speaking about a situation that had happened years before where God had shown him, I'm here to reach everybody. Peter continues, God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them, just as he did to us. He did not discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith also. Now then, as a result of all that, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of Gentiles a yoke, a law, a rule, a burden that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? It's like, listen, guys, we got all these rules, we got these laws, we got all this stuff. Like, we have tried for hundreds of years to follow this stuff, and we haven't done it successfully. Why in the world do we expect them to be able to do it successfully too? In fact, if we and if they could actually keep the law, obey all of these laws, then there wouldn't have been a need for a Savior at all. He continues, no, we believe it's through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are. So they talk about it a little bit more, and eventually James, the brother of Jesus, he chimes in. He speaks up in order to kind of end this entire debate. This is what James says. He says, guys, it's my judgment. I believe that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. And that right there is the thing that the church has struggled with throughout its history. That's the tension that the church has continued to struggle with in various ways throughout its entire history. Because the truth is, gravity causes us to constantly drift towards drift to keep outsiders out. The gravitational pull of the church will constantly cause us to keep outsiders out and to focus on insiders, to tell people that are outside of our faith, outside of our church, listen, you're not good enough. You need to get your life in order first in order to earn God's grace. But this is so backwards. That's not even the definition of grace. The actual definition of grace is unearned favor. You can't earn it. You can't get your life in order and then earn God's grace. That's so backwards. Grace actually leads to transformation, not the other way around. Transformation won't lead you to receiving more grace from God. And so we just want, as a church, to take James's words to heart. We want to take action to guard ourselves against these things that cause the church to drift away from its original mission, from its original vision. We want to avoid the drift, and we need to avoid the drift toward insiders and away from outsiders. I mean, it's natural for us to cater to insiders. It's natural for us to go their direction. Because insiders, let's face it, they're the ones that provide the resources, the finances that allow us to do any of this stuff in the first place. Insiders are the ones that have the opinions. Insiders are the ones that create the feedback and help us get better. Like, insiders are the ones that have all the complaints. They're the ones that complain about things. It's natural for us to want to cater to insiders. But here's what I believe. And I think this is what Jesus believes. The church is not for church people. The church is for all people. So we want to avoid the drift toward insiders and away from outsiders. We also need to avoid the drift toward law and away from grace. You see, the church naturally gravitates towards policies, towards rules, towards regulations, towards this is how we do things. And policies, they can serve as great guardrails. Like, policies can set us up to make sure that we're making good decisions and not making bad decisions and not going in a bad direction. Like, they can serve as great guardrails. But they also have the potential, far too often, to end conversations before we even have a chance to start them. And so our goal at Current is to create conversations, to engage with people, because policies tend to close doors. Now, when we take that approach, when we decide, you know what, we're going to engage in conversation before we create a policy, the truth is that creates some messy stuff. But isn't it true that all authentic community is messy? Isn't it true that messes are kind of unavoidable if we want to be in an authentic connection, an authentic relationship with our God? Isn't that unavoidable? And Peter says that God, who knows our hearts, he responded to you. He responded to me before we changed our bad behavior. I mean, isn't it true? Like, don't you want that to be true, that God responds to you, that God offers you grace before you change your bad behavior? Don't you want to experience transformation in your life, but don't you want God to still love you, to still reach out to you and respond to you before you figure out how to get it right? And if that's true of you, if you want that to be true of you, why shouldn't that be true of other people that are outsiders when it comes to our faith? Now listen, sometimes creating policies, drawing lines, that's necessary, I get it. But we want to try and avoid creating policies before we have conversations, before we walk people right out our door, before we even have a chance to talk to them. You never know, we might, by creating policies, might cause us to never even have a chance to have a conversation because people walk away from us or don't even show up in the first place because we've drawn the line. And the third thing that we need to avoid is we need to avoid the drift toward preserving instead of advancing. You see, the more successful we are as a church, and successful is kind of a weird word to use when it comes to church, but the more success we have in reaching people and leading them to follow Jesus and equipping them to follow Jesus with their lives, the more successful we are at that, and the more people that come and be a part of this thing, and I hope that happens for us. But the more that it happens, the more we have to lose. The more that our church grows, the more natural it's going to be for us to be less vision-driven and more preservation-driven, try and keep what we already have. But God doesn't call us to close off and preserve what we had. He calls us to go. He calls us to reach. He calls us to make followers of Him. So what we want to do at Current is we want to swim against the current that pulls us away from that mission, that pulls us away from our original vision. So as a church, we want to be more concerned with who it is that we are reaching than who it is that we are keeping. We believe, just like James says, as far as our church is concerned, we should not make it difficult for people who are turning to God. And hopefully, when people show up at Current, hopefully they experience the grace and hopefully they experience the truth of a Savior that loves them deeply.